Only 1% of players dare to play this rare and aggressive opening, the McDonald Gambit. In this video, I'll show you why it's a hidden weapon worth knowing. e4 followed by e5, the king's pawn opening. A very standard and common setup. But now comes the first surprise. We play d4. This position is known as the center game, and you can probably guess why. There are now 3 pawns aiming directly at the center. Most players will simply capture the pawn on d4. If they don't, that's usually a mistake, because you'll be the one to capture their center pawn instead, gaining central control. Now, when they do take the pawn, here's where it gets interesting. Instead of the usual developing moves like knight to f3 or bishop to c4, we play pawn to f4. This isn't the typical way players approach the center game. Most go for quiet development. But this move, f4, it leads us into a much more aggressive and lesser-known line, with a much higher win rate. Next, black will often play knight to c6 to support their extra pawn, and that's exactly the position we're aiming for. Now, black is up a pawn. Naturally, they'll want to hold on to it, and that makes perfect sense. So our next step is to apply pressure with knight to f3, targeting that central pawn. In response, black will usually defend with bishop to c5, reinforcing their pawn. At this point, it becomes clear we're probably not getting that pawn back anytime soon. With both the bishop and the knight defending it, it's well protected, and we don't have a direct way to challenge it right now. So instead of obsessing over that pawn, we shift focus. We continue developing bishop to d3. And yes, there is a reason we place the bishop here, which will become clear in just a few moves. Typically, black continues standard development, something like knight to f6, a very natural and common move in this position. Now, we castle kingside, getting our king to safety. And in most games, black will do the same, kingside castle. But believe it or not, this is actually where black starts to fall into danger. Why did we place the bishop on d3 earlier? Because now we get to push pawn to e5, attacking the knight and opening a deadly diagonal. When black's knight jumps into the center, often knight to d5, that's when we strike. This is where we unleash the famous tactic known as the Greek gift sacrifice. Bishop takes h7, check. At this point, black doesn't have many good options. After you sacrifice the bishop with bishop takes h7 check, they either accept the sacrifice or try to sidestep with king to h8. But your response is the same either way. Let's say they capture the bishop, the most common reaction. You immediately follow up with knight to g5, delivering check. Now black's choices are extremely limited. If they take the knight using their queen, you simply recapture with the pawn, and you're up material with a completely winning position. If instead they move the king, they only have a couple of legal moves, and none of them are good. Often, they'll try king to g8, the only square that avoids immediate disaster. But if they panic and play king to g6, that's a huge mistake. Now you strike with pawn to f5, delivering check. Your bishop from d1 is guarding the knight on g5, so the king can't capture it, and the only legal move is king to h6. And again, your bishop is doing the heavy lifting. It's covering your knight, so you have plenty of time. Now comes the finisher, queen to g4. You're threatening queen to h4, checkmate, and there's really no effective way for black to stop it. Even if they had played king to h6 right away after knight to g5 check, you still have a crushing move, queen to d3. This simple move threatens queen to h7, mate in 1, and there's no good defense. No matter what black tries, they're walking straight into checkmate. At this point, most players will just capture your knight and hope for the best. And honestly, if you trade your knight for their queen, you're already winning. That's a great outcome. They might try to stop your attack with pawn to g6, blocking your queen. But here's the trick. Swing your queen to h3, deliver check, and after the king moves, it's queen to h7, checkmate. Now, if they play more carefully and go king to g8, the classic follow-up in this Greek gift combo is queen to h5, threatening mate in 1. Their best defensive move here, and it's not even a joke, is to give up their queen by taking your knight. If they do that, you're clearly winning. But most players won't give up their queen. Instead, they'll try rook to e8, hoping to escape with their king. If you rush in with queen to h7, they'll run, and there's no forced checkmate after that. So instead, play it smart. Take the pawn on f7 with your queen. This forces king to h8. Now continue with queen to h5, forcing king to g8, then queen to h7, forcing king to f8, and finally queen to h8, leading to king to e7. You're pulling their king into the open, and from here, the attack becomes unstoppable. After you capture the pawn on f7, the key moment comes when you play queen to g7. And now, with no pawn on f7 blocking the path, it's a direct checkmate. The king has no escape. All of this unfolds in just around 15 moves, a clean, crushing win from a little-known gambit in the center game. Let's rewind for a moment, back to the early stages. After knight to c6, which is by far the most common response, you play knight to f3, but not everyone follows the main line. Some opponents will try to get fancy and play bishop to b4, giving a check. This needs a bit of caution, but there's a simple and solid response. Just block with pawn to c3. Now, most players will capture that pawn with their bishop, and that actually works in your favor. Why? Because after pawn takes c3, you develop your knight to c3 with tempo. Even better, many players will go ahead and trade the bishop for your knight. And that's great news. If they don't, your knight is likely to jump into the center later, especially after you castle, and a centralized knight in that position becomes incredibly powerful. Since they don't want your knight to become too powerful in the center later on, most players will trade it off while they can. So after bishop takes c3, you recapture with the pawn. Sure, it's not a perfect pawn structure, but that doubled pawn won't cause any real problems, especially since black has no way to attack it right now. From here, most opponents will play pawn to d6, trying to prevent you from pushing e5. But if they instead go for knight to f6, don't hesitate. Go straight for pawn to e5 and bring your bishop to d3, aiming for the familiar aggressive setup. In most cases, though, you'll see d6, then you continue with bishop to d3, knight to f6 from black, and you castle kingside. If they also castle, then this should look familiar. It's the same setup we saw earlier. You play pawn to e5. If they capture, you recapture. When they go knight to d5, it's déjà vu. The Greek gift sacrifice is on the board again. Bishop takes h7, check. If they accept, knight to g5, and the same deadly pattern repeats. Whether they give up their queen or run their king, the result is the same. They're walking straight into a brutal finish. Now let's go back for a moment. Castling too early, especially by move 9, is the real mistake. A better try for black is to play bishop to g4, pinning your knight. That's a smarter defense. But even here, there's a strong plan. You don't panic, you simply go pawn to e5. Notice the recurring themes. Bishop on d3, push e5, attack the knight. These patterns show up again and again in this gambit, which makes it both easy to remember and incredibly dangerous. So after you push e5 and they capture, you recapture. And now black has two common options. They'll either move their knight to the center, usually knight to d5, or they'll get greedy and take your central pawn. If they choose knight to d5, that's your cue to play bishop to c4, adding a second attacker to that knight. Most players will respond with something simple like pawn to b6, trying to solidify. And here's where it gets tactical. You hit them with bishop takes f7, check. If they ignore it, you just want a pawn. But if they capture, which they almost always will, you follow up with knight to g5, a discovered double check from your rook and knight. Since it's double check, the king must move. Worst case for black, they retreat to e8, and you grab their bishop with a better position. But if they play king to g8, you've got an even nastier trick. Here's the brilliant shot. Rook to f8, check. Now if they take the rook with their queen, you respond with queen to b3, check, and it's over. Their king is boxed in, they'll try to block, and you'll sweep their pieces on your way to checkmate. If instead they take the rook with their king, you go queen to f1, check. Their best and only defense is to block with queen to f6, sacrificing their queen. Because if they move the king, you've got queen to f7, mate. No matter how they respond, it's all falling apart for black. This line wins fast and brilliantly.